Yes, sir. It's Sunday morning. It's Thanksgiving week, and it's going to be a good week. It's eating season, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody pumped about pies? Yeah. Cherry pie? Pecan pie? Pumpkin pie? Oh. There's one called Alsatian tart. You guys may not know what that is, but it is delicious too. Look it up. It's really, really good. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about this week. It's going to be a good week. I know this week also comes with all kinds of feelings and emotions because this is the week you get to spend time with family. And that's either a really, really good thing or sometimes it's kind of a really, really uneasy, nerve-wracking, oh my gosh kind of thing. And so wherever you are this week, can I just encourage you to be present no matter what you're doing? Be present with your family, whether it's your immediate family or your extended family or whatever, and just be present where you are, not thinking or wishing you were somewhere else. It's amazing what can happen when we just allow presence to be the prevailing thing, whether it's God's presence in our lives or our presence in other people's lives. I just want to encourage you to do that. And it is a week to give thanks. We have so much to be thankful for. It's wonderful to get to be together this morning, and it's wonderful to get to spend this week in whatever way we're going to get to spend this week. You know, we're jumping into a new series today, and it's such an interesting concept, or not concept, it's such an interesting question. You know, today, with as intelligent as people are, with as creative, resourceful, talented, as kind of hardworking, we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and get things done. We're independent. We're fully capable of doing far more than most think we can do. We live in a day that more and more has become known rather than unknown. There's less that is not known than once was. Today is more predictable than ever before. We are more resourced than ever before. There are advances in science that are just mind-blowing, phenomenal. The question is, in the midst of all of that, is you got to ask the question, do we really need God? I mean, you've got to ask it, don't you? Where there's so many people, you may have people that you know that, man, their life looks really better than yours does. They're nicer than you, they care for people better than you, they make more money than you, they do all these things, and they don't love God. At least not the God that you love. And it makes you kind of wonder, what do you have to offer them? What are you going to say that's going to make them go, oh, yeah, I'd rather have your life than mine? And it makes you wonder, what do you have to offer? And that obviously makes inquiring minds have to ask the question, who really needs God? You know, the fact is that there are lots of people who would answer that question, do we need God, with a yes, but they don't always live like it. And there are people who would answer that question with no, but find God difficult to completely dismiss. And so there are many people on this earth that would say, well, who needs religion? And so we find ourselves in the situation where more and more Americans are backing away from religion, therefore more and more are backing away from God altogether. It's not because atheism is attractive. It's just simply because institutional religion is less attractive. That's what it boils down to. And so millions of people have stepped out of religious leanings into this no man's land. See, it's not an argumentative position by any means. It simply is that I just don't want to affiliate with God. There are people who they're not hostile towards God. In fact, they'll talk to you about God all day long. They're really nice folks, and they'll be glad to have a conversation with you. They're not hostile towards God. They're just also not affiliated with God either. Fact is, 35% of millennials would fall into this category, those born 1981 to 1996. The millennials in the room would look and go, yeah, that's true. A third of my friends, that's probably a good way to put them into a category. Males are more prone than females to have this mindset. Most in this mindset are left-leaning, white, non-immigrants. That's kind of where this population is identified as. The majority are ex-Christian or ex-church. This group includes atheists as well as agnostics. The truth, though, is that the majority of them still believe in God. They're just theologically agnostic. They believe in God just from a theological perspective. They're agnostic. Fact is, they don't know. It doesn't matter. All people are connected in some form or fashion. Let's just keep and stay light when it comes to the things of God, especially with conversation and stuff like that. Let's keep it light. Fact of the matter is that this group, if you were going to define them in some form or fashion, this would be a group that we define as tired of institutional religion. They're tired of it. They see it as irrelevant. They see it as just ignorant following for people who need kind of a crutch, if you get down to it. Something we have to own today is that atheism and Christianity have something in common. They have something in common, and that is most people typically embrace something without knowing fully what they're embracing. They embrace something before they really know what they're getting into. And that's something that Christianity as well as atheism share. Because people don't really embrace atheism or agnosticism as much as they let go of religion. And you really back somebody in the corner. It really is just I'm just kind of anti-religion. I'm tired of this machine known as the church. People generally get run off from Christianity and they find themselves wandering in this kind of no man's land of no theological foundation while here on this earth. Now, the thing that we've gotten really good at as a church is we've gotten really good at caring for these people. And way to go. That's something that we should be very proud of. Folks who are hurting, who are wounded, people who are tired of church, tired of it being one way. We love fighting that norm. And that's something that we've gotten really pretty good at. And so this is an encouraging thing. But if you're sitting in this room today, and maybe you're sitting in this room and you are wrestling with God in your life, you are wrestling with, is this all kind of something that's made up? Or maybe, what if I'm wrong? You know, and there's been some things that you're questioning about God. This is going to be a really good series for us. Maybe you're sitting in this room and you are in the place where you're like, I'm pretty well done because it's just not working for me. You know, and maybe you find, but you're giving just kind of the college try at the end here, hoping that you see something bigger that kind of shows itself. The truth that we're going to talk about today is the simple truth that the gods that we usually abandon never existed to begin with. And this is where we get the privilege of looking at a real hard look at where we've come from, the influences that have been in our life up to this point, especially when it comes to the things of God and church and religion and faith and all of that. And so my disclaimer for you today is that today and for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to do my very best to try to convince you that the God that you lost or the God that you're willing to give up on probably never existed in the first place. And the truth is that you've had the wrong God. You've got the wrong God. And it's time to kind of figure out who the right God is. And so we're going to talk about it over the next couple of weeks. But my disclaimer for today is that we're not going to open up the Word of God a single time during this morning's message. And the reason for that is we're going to go through 6 gods that we grew up with. And we're going to talk about these gods. And so we need to have a conversation just kind of together here about these gods that have bubbled to the top, but they're not biblically based. And the fact is that they're based out of our upbringing. They're based out of somebody who told us about this God. And they're based in these different... And so today we're just going to have an honest look at these 6 gods that we grew up with. And then next week we'll dive in and take it from there. So we're just going to kind of set the foundation of today just in owning some of the things that we may be a little off on. And so we'll work through these. These are not, so we're going to work through those. But here's the thing we have to give ourselves permission to do. We have to give ourselves permission to doubt the existence of God. We have to give ourselves permission to doubt whether God is really who he says he is or not. We have to give ourselves that permission. When I was in school and I was doing my education, there was a book that I read that it was by Frederick Buechner, and it stuck with me. This phrase that he said in there, what he said was, doubt is the ants in the pants of faith that keep it moving. See, God can handle your and my doubt. And so it's okay for us to doubt. It's okay for us to have questions. It's okay for us to poke holes. It's okay for others to poke holes in what we believe. It's okay. This is what keeps our faith moving. This is what keeps us where we need to be as a people. And so we give ourselves permission today. And the permission is every single person in this room has religious doubts. Every single person in this room. There is nobody that's been exempt of that at some point in your life. And so we have to be able to have permission to do this. The thing that we have to be reminded of also is that the early Christians actually were considered atheists of their day, because they were telling that everybody had the wrong God and that the God of Jesus was the right God. And so they actually were called atheists, heretics, and all of that. And so we find ourselves in this kind of similar situation today. And so let me see if I can capture the story of how many people's stories, whether it's you or whether it's somebody that you know, whether it's a family member, it's somebody. But here's how the story kind of plays out. It plays out like this. You grew up in a religious environment. You experienced a childhood conversion, and then you transitioned into an irreligious environment, whether it was school or work or some other environment, and you found that you liked it. Maybe you liked it a lot, a whole lot. And you began asking adult questions about your childhood faith. And then you found yourself receiving faith-based answers for fact-based questions. And then all of a sudden you woke up one day and realized, I don't believe anymore. Now that may be your story, or it may be somebody's story that you know, a family member, you're going, yeah, that's it. It pains me to hear that story, whatever it is. That may be the story. The truth is that the versions of God that people usually leave never existed in the first place. Karen Armstrong says it this way. She does a great job capturing it. She says, many of us have been left stranded with an incoherent concept of God. We learned about God about the same time we were told about Santa Claus. But while our understanding of the Santa Claus phenomenon has evolved and matured, our theology remains somewhat infantile. Not surprisingly, when we attained intellectual maturity, many of us rejected the God we had inherited and denied that he existed. Now maybe you've been in this conversation like I've been in several times, where you talk to somebody about God and you recognize that the God they're talking about and the God you're talking about are two very different things. In fact, I find myself regularly talking to people and they'll talk about their God to me and I'll go, I don't believe in that God. That's not the God that I know. And I find myself going, you know what? If that's the God that you believe in, I don't blame you for having doubts about your God. If that's the God that you believe that we're talking about, I don't blame you for looking at it and going, I don't want to have anything to do with church. I don't want to have anything to do with religion. I don't want to have anything to do with all of this. And you may have been in those conversations where you hear those people talk about their God and you go, oh my gosh, we're on two different playing fields here. We're talking about something very, very different. And I've found myself in that a lot. And so today, let's talk about 6 gods that we grew up with. Let's talk about these 6 gods that don't exist, and that if that's the God that we're believing in, we should no longer believe in that God. So we're going to have a little bit of fun. These are not new to me. These are Andy Stanley, a pastor in Georgia. He's the one who put these together, and I felt like it was not important for me to reinvent the wheel. And so he did a good job capturing these. So I'm going to utilize those in order to help us kind of understand these gods that we grew up with that we need to trash and get rid of. And the first one is this. It's the bodyguard God. The first is the bodyguard God. It's the God that doesn't allow bad things to happen to good, innocent people. You see, that's the one we grew up with, man. We grew up believing in this God, the God that does not allow bad things to happen to good people. At least not good, innocent people, right? How could God let something bad happen to good people? You see, there's a flaw in this, because nobody on the face of the planet has ever built an argument, or at least a good argument, based on the lack of evil in the world. Nobody has. Because this is a leftover from childhood. It's a leftover from the way that we think. And this would be like somebody saying that there's not a creator of the iPhone because there's so many broken iPhones in the world. That's what it is like. And so we have to understand, pain is not a rational reason to not believe in God. It's not a rational reason. It is an emotional reason, though. And emotionally, we can look at this and go, man, that hurts so bad. How can that be a good God? We can have that emotional conversation there. There's no doubt about it. I mean, for us to believe in this bodyguard God, it takes some mental gymnastics. However, this guy, if you look at the bodyguard God, for this to be an argument against the existence of God, somebody's got to assume that a good God would not allow bad things to happen to good people. And if bad things happen to good people, there must not be a good God. Or God must not be good. And so we have this bodyguard God, and the thing that we have to remember is that Christianity at its core started with a horrible thing happening to a really good person, the Son of God. And so we have to understand, with this being the case, this bodyguard God that we grew up with doesn't exist. And so if you have this mentality that God is this bodyguard God, it's time to stop believing in that God, because that God does not exist. Another God is the on-demand God. This is that God who always responds to fair and selfless requests the way we would respond. We call that answered prayer, is the church thing that we like to say. This God who always responds to fair and selfless requests the way that we would respond. You see, a good God, right, would respond to every selfless and sincere request, and as long as God responds to those requests, then God must exist. But how many of you have asked for something from God and got crickets in return? Yeah, right? Every single one of us in this room. And so I guess if you asking these selfless requests to God and God answers with crickets, does that not mean that God does not exist? Or that a good God doesn't exist? Is that what that means? And so this on-demand God, you look for God to follow through the way that you want him to, and he falls short. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who told you that God always responds to requests the way that you expect him to respond? It may have been a pastor. It may have been your priest. Who told you? Who told you that God responds that way? Because the fact is that this on-demand God doesn't exist. And if you've lost faith because of this on-demand God, I don't blame you. Good for you. Because that God doesn't exist. Lose faith in that God, because that God doesn't exist. The next one is my second favorite. We'll get to my favorite here in a second, but my second favorite is the boyfriend God. This is a God we grew up with. The God whose presence can always be felt. As long as those good feelings are there, God must be present. You know He cares about you. You know He loves you. He wants to be with you. But the moment in which you don't feel Him, what does that mean? He must be gone, right? Or you need to break up with Him, right? Because if He's not going to pay attention to you, it's time to kick Him to the curb. Get another one. The boyfriend God. The gods whose presence can always be felt, but if it can't, maybe He doesn't exist. This is another expectation we're taught. It's another thought process about God that we learn through our desires and our wants. But the truth is, this God doesn't exist. Now, this is the scary one here, and that is you grew up, and I grew up, with the guilt God. The guilt God. You know, that one that no matter what you do, it's never enough. You can lay your life down for others. You can do all these things, but it's just never enough. And we grew up with this God. Many of you are familiar with this thought process. Many are familiar. Because this God controls through guilt and controls through fear. This God is the God that if you're enjoying life, something must be wrong. Right? Because, there's got to be sin in there somewhere if something's fun and enjoyable. There's got to be. Especially if we're talking sexual, right? If it's fun and enjoyable, there's got to be something wrong. This guilt God, no matter what you do, it's never enough. This is the God that you know loves you but doesn't really like you very much. Am I there? Do you know this God? Have you interacted with this God before? Yeah, right? The fact is that you may be in this room today and you're thinking, man, yeah, that's the God I gave up on. And nobody blames you for that because you probably got real tired of feeling guilty all the time. Or maybe you're in this room today and you're like, oh gosh, I think that's the God I believe in. And you're really sick of feeling guilty. And it's time to be set free, right? Well, the good news is that God doesn't exist. The guilt God does not exist. Can you hear me? The guilt God does not exist. It is a God that we grew up with that we need to leave in our childhood. That God does not exist. Now here is my favorite of the gods we grew up with. Favorite in a weird kind of way. It's the anti-science God. You know that God that says you have to choose between undeniable science or unreliable religion. And so, in other words, you got to quit thinking, you got to quit thinking and start believing. This is the one. See, this one's got me all worked up. I can't even talk because, man, this one drives me crazy. Because this is the one that many people on this earth look at Christianity and they shake their head. And there's many believers that look at science and they just shake their head. And guys, this God doesn't exist. You got to choose between undeniable science or unreliable religion. God gave us this amazing brain to process and to think and to figure things out and to create new ways of learning more about our solar system and our world than we ever thought possible to know. Why in the world would we turn that off? That's crazy talk. That's crazy. That's why a very well-known atheist named Richard Dawkins wrote in his book, The God Delusion, he said, one of the truly bad effects of religion is that it teaches us that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. And we wonder why people question, do we really need God? We wonder. I mean, if you have to choose between a God who created the earth in 6 days, thinking that the earth is now 6,000 years old, and the God who created 4.55 billion-year-old earth, no wonder you find yourself today in a place where you have lost your faith in God. No wonder. If you got to choose between those two, the truth is that those two are much closer than you think. We're not going to talk about that today. You'll just have to come back at a later week in order to get that one. Shameless teaser, right? And then here's the catch-all, right? This final God that we all grew up with, it's the gap God. It's the gap God, where God conveniently shows up as an explanation for everything we can't explain. You know? Where we're like, oh, I don't know, must be God. Oh, I don't know, I'll ask him when I die. When I get to heaven, I'm asking him about that one. You know, that's what we say, right? We just loop it all in there. We're like, oh, must be God. He's a funny guy. You know, and it's like, it's crazy to me, where it's like this God, yeah, conveniently shows up for our ignorance. Right? As an explanation for everything that we can't explain. You see, this is something that's been around for a long, long time. I mean, ancient people, they always filled God in. Many always filled God in for everything. Well, the situation has changed though, right? Because as time goes on and there are advances that go on, and we learn more, the list of what we can't explain is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, is it not? It's getting smaller and smaller. Well, you got to realize that this whole God catching and showing up for everything that we can't explain, we have to understand eventually that kind of begins to undermine our faith. We've got to be careful to not let it hijack, because what is unexplainable today may be explainable tomorrow. And if you look at somebody and say, well, it's unexplainable, it must be God, and then tomorrow it's explained, how big is your God? It's kind of wild, isn't it? I mean, not to mention, unexplainable is not evidence for the existence of God either, for that matter, if you really get down to it. And so there's many of you in this room, or you know somebody, maybe it's a parent or a sibling or a cousin or whatever, and you're going to see them this week, who've left religion and they've left this God that is the God of the gap, right? The fact is that God's not worth living or following, because that God doesn't exist. And so today we look at these gods and we go, those are gods I don't believe in. And maybe you find yourself that those are the gods that have pulled you away from church, away from faith, away from religion. Maybe they're ones that have pulled people you know away. Maybe whatever it is. What I want to say today, and I want to encourage you to say to the people that perhaps maybe we've been able to identify some of your conversation, identify a God that some of your conversations have centered around with the people you love deeply. If you have stopped believing in any of these gods, or your friends or your neighbors or your family, if they've stopped believing in these gods, let's celebrate that. Can we say, yes, that's awesome, right? It's awesome to stop believing in these gods. Because these gods don't exist. They're gods of a childhood faith. These are gods that you got to grow up, and you got to recognize. You got to see the truth for what it is. And so if you've walked away from any of these gods, I want to congratulate you, because just like Cupid, Frosty, and Rudolph, they don't exist. Sorry. Some of those in there I think you wanted to exist. But these are not reasons to give up on God, right? These are not reasons to give up on God. All these are is simply a combination of unmet expectations, childhood expectations, ill-informed interpretation, and blatant manipulation. It may be from a pastor that you had in the past. It may be from a priest that you've worshipped under their leadership. It may be because of a father and the way that he parented you growing up. It may be because of a teacher that you had in school that influenced at a certain level. These gods are all based on expectations that we put on God. Did you notice that? See, every one of these gods that we've talked about today, they're expectations that don't originate from God himself. They originate from us. These expectations we put on God, which is a very irrational way to determine if something or someone is real. I mean, it's just like nobody in this room that talks to a small child that says that their father is never present. They call and he won't answer the phone. They never get to hug him and feel his presence. None of us would look at that child and say, your father doesn't exist. It's irrational. And so, we have to begin asking questions ourselves. And the question we need to ask ourselves today is kind of as we come to a close and as we begin to kind of pull this thing together, setting ourselves up for the coming weeks. Where did your God originate from? And where did your belief in God originate from? Right? So today we want to ask the question, where did my view of God originate from? Is it from a parent? Is it from a friend? Is it from a co-worker? Is it from an educator? Where did your view of God originate from? As you can tell, today I'm not sitting here trying to create an argument for God. I'm simply creating the argument or suggesting that if you or someone you know has walked away from God, perhaps the God they've walked away from doesn't exist and never has existed in the first place. Because nobody needs a somebody told me so God, do they? Nobody needs that God. The next week we get a chance to talk through whether we need a Bible tells me so Jesus. And how that Jesus may just be too fragile to really be of much help anyway. And so everybody, we get the privilege of walking through this door. We get the privilege of walking through the door and asking the question, who really needs God? In hopes that everybody in this room gets the privilege of being introduced to the real Jesus and his God. That's the hope. Because if that were to happen, it might just change everything. Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for our time. We thank you for the fact that we can sit here today, we can stand here today, and we can ask these questions, and you're not sitting there scared. We know that you can handle these questions. And I thank you, Father, for the foundation that gives us the privilege of pushing against the machine. And I pray, Father, that you will help us to find a freedom that exists, because we don't have to fear a God who is all about pouring guilt and condemnation and shame on us. But instead, we can be set free by the God who there is nothing we will ever do that will make him love us any less. And so, Father, as we embark on this journey together of asking this very dangerous question of whether we really need you or not, thank you for the fact that we can ask that question, and you already know the answer. You know our need for you. And Father, I pray that you help us to discover it together. Because Father, we do. We do need you. But we don't need these other gods. We need the God of the universe. We need the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We need God with us. We need the God who focuses on who we are rather than what we do and don't do. We need the God who has genuinely come to save, because we will perpetually make mistakes. But rather than being crushed by them, we can learn and be set free. So Father, may we meet you, and may we meet you for who you are, rather than perhaps who we've thought you've been all this time. We love you and we thank you and we pray these things in the saving name of Jesus Christ.